So this is a story that begins like all good stories with an economics education conference. Um, Yana and I were talking after Sea Tree in Portland, having a nice sort of 24 hours before we had to go back to the UK. And whilst exploring the wonderful mountains in the area, we were having that other great academic conversation we often all have, which is why was I just rejected several times from different journals, etc., between us. Um, and we were thinking, well, if we want to get published in this sort of economics education field, then we clearly need more evidence for what we're doing. So how do we get more evidence out of the students and things that we're interacting with? When we do stuff in the classrooms, how do we get the feedback we want that we can convert into something that we would think of as rigorous evaluation? And so we started having this sort of back of the envelope conversation. And we thought, well, if we want students to give us feedback or participate in stuff, surely we have to incentivize them. And what would those incentives look like? It could be anything from, really novel stuff to just good old hard cash. And we were thinking about this kind of plane where, like, maybe different things live on this in different places. We could do giveaways with high value things like iPads, good cash value, very low novelty. Lots of them have them these days. We could give them cash itself. We could do more novel things that maybe they don't value so much, like a pizza party with us. We could do stuff that's really cheap, like give them a LinkedIn badge or a winner's certificate. Very cheap, but they're not going to get it anywhere else. And then we were thinking of all the other things we'd seen in that conference, and we've been talking about some of the crazy rubber duck trophies we'd be given out for coding challenges at the time. And we thought, well, which of these are the ones that we should go for? What's going to be most effective to get students engaging? And we thought, well, the place that we must be able to answer this from is the Econ Ed literature, right? That must be telling us what these students are responding to. And if you do want to fall asleep for the next 5 minutes, the short answer is we couldn't get that out of the literature, but it led us down this whole other rabbit hole. So let me take you down that rabbit hole for a few minutes. We were thinking about the difficulties of publishing in Econ Ed and trying to think about how we'd advise people around us to sort of really get started. So where should you get published? What do you need to get started? What sort of approaches do you need? And we wanted to be able to put that kind of information together in one place so that others could benefit from it. And that led to a few different sort of activities that we did. What I'm going to talk about today is the review we did of some of the journals out there and sort of the standards that are used or at least reported in evaluations of what happens in the classroom. There's other things as well. So some people here will have attended the first summer school we did last year, looking at how best to sort of design experimental methods for evaluating stuff in the classroom. But let me stick today with this review, still somewhat in progress, of existing journals. I will say it's not the first time this has happened. I'm sure it won't be the last. There's lots of other good stuff out there about what we're publishing in economic education, and who's publishing in it, looking at things like citations and who authors are, etc. But none of them really gave us the sort of nitty-gritty details of really what is done within these studies. It was sort of much more high level, maybe sometimes topics and so on. So we picked three journals, two major reasons for this. One, this is the set of journals that are used in the Birdie et al. Studies. There's a series of these in IRE looking at the different topics that are coming up in this sort of econ ed field. The other reason, frankly, is these are the three that I find most commonly discussed and recommended to us in and around the conferences I go to. Funnily enough, I was at an event yesterday, and these were indeed the three that were first discussed for the first hour of the conversation. So that's why we started with these three. And what we did was we took those journals, we took a few years of data. Let's check, yeah. I'll show you that in a second. And we divided it up into sort of four main types of studies. And I'm going to concentrate on the last one. So the ones I'm not really interested in are the other big meta studies, things that are case studies without any evaluation of the work. And things which would normally belong in the sort of economics of education field, looking at sort of sector-wide changes and so on. What we're really interested in is what we've called evaluation studies here, and which I would summarize simply as people who do a thing in the course of their teaching, maybe in the classroom, and they want to understand what the impact of that thing was. And so we've kind of really concentrated on those because we wanted to extract from that the details as to how best to go about that, how best to get, people participating through the right incentives, but also understanding the extent to which people might be trying to use RCTs, what dependent variables were, and so on. So we've got things amongst those studies on who the authors are, but what the intervention was. And they've tried to look at some more of the specifics, including things like ethics and sample size. That's what I'm going to show you today. If you're interested, across these three journals between the years 2022 and 2025, we're looking at adding some more years to that, but that's where we are at the moment. You get quite a different distribution across journals of those different types of studies. That's 225 articles we read in total. For the AI enthusiasts out there, this project began a little while ago. We read these manually. So that's 225 papers read between us manually. And I'm going to focus today on this evaluation studies section, as I said. And we've got only 62 of those 225 papers actually fall into the kind of evaluation studies category. So only 62 papers along the lines of, I did a thing, I tried to measure the impact of the thing, and it was this. You'll see as well that a lot of these come from IRI in particular, but there are a few in JAT and a few in JE, so I'll explain as I go along. So, broad overview of the sort of descriptive stats that came out of those studies. So first thing we sort of looked at was, well, what's being studied, which courses are being studied. Lots, I think, unsurprisingly, coming from the world of intro and micro in particular. A lot less out there on the likes of econometrics and macro. So Olga, it's great to see you talking about some macro just now. And perhaps as expected, very few RCTs within that. It's quite hard to run an RCT on our classes, so in a way that didn't surprise us. But what I was surprised by was the fact that there are a number of people who've managed to do it quite successfully. And then the data seems to come from a mixture of either what we've called administrative, so we've just sort of pulled it out of the VLE, this is data that would exist for your course otherwise, or survey data, we've gone in and deliberately tried to gather some extra data on how they felt about the thing or how they performed in the thing, and then quite often people using a combination of those two. We also looked at how they were sort of trying to conduct the analysis of the thing that they did. And the reason for looking at this specifically within the econ ed field is that we've both had this hunch that we might be trying to do this differently to other people who do education studies. So it wasn't really a huge surprise to find out that economists, when looking at econ ed studies, focus a lot on quantitative methodologies. Some use both quant and qual, and very few use qual only. When they do quant stuff, it's also overwhelmingly a regression approach. Occasionally, it's simply through descriptive stats. Now, I'm going to really apologize at this point to anyone here who would call themselves a qualitative researcher or likes to use qualitative techniques. When you see the word qual here, I don't want you to think of a formal qualitative methodology. The bar for qual here was so insultingly low. I really do have to apologize. But that's partly because there was so little of it. Really, our bar for qual here is simply like, were they even looking at a feedback comment? So we're not even talking formal qualitative processes, just were they trying to analyze something that wasn't a number? And you can sort of see that further down here. There's not really like anything along the lines of, there's occasionally a sort of thematic analysis or sentiment analysis, quite a few looking at feedback comments, but really the overwhelming concentration here is on quantitative approaches. Perhaps not surprising out of our econ community. The other thing about those regressions is typically that Y variable is focusing on grades. Nothing wrong with that. Our students like high grades. We like our students to be learning and to achieve well. But even if I think back to Malta's talk at the beginning and sort of, some of the motivations for doing the stuff he's doing, is because our students and our, sector is multidimensional, right? There are lots of different things we might want to look at. Student satisfaction might be something. We might be wanting to look at sort of stuff that relates to what regulators are asking us to look at, and so on. Student sense of belonging, for example. So while grades are super important, they do seem to dominate the regression analysis, perhaps because they lend themselves to that really easily too. Other things we looked at, how many people do you need in your study in order to get something out of it? Quite a few of these studies, of those 62 studies, have fewer than 100 people in there. Very few have large numbers, which, I don't know, if you're coming straight from sort of a field journal and you're suddenly looking at sort of what's expected in the Econ Ed publication might be something for people to get their heads around. But probably what I found more surprising out of this section was that it seems that reporting of ethics is not something we do consistently or routinely across journals or even across types of studies. So we looked for essentially anything in the paper that would mention that an ethics approval was either done or not required. Or we also looked for IRBs, institutional review boards as well, where they apply across institutions. That was kind of the bar for talking about ethics. So only 36% of those 62 studies actually gave some indication of what those ethics requirements were. Perhaps unsurprisingly, at least it felt unsurprising to me, a lot of the papers are published based on courses happening in the US. It's a sharp drop to second place for the UK and followed by Canada. And then you've got really just one or two studies here or there that mention other countries. Malta, good news. You can add some more for Germany there. And I have to say that of these are overwhelmingly in IRI. So there were very, very few cross-country studies. Well, cross-country studies will be multiple. So there's a few of those, but they're all in IRI. In JE, the concentration really was on the US and the UK and similar for JET. To take this back to the story where I started when I was interested in what incentives people used, the other interesting thing we found when looking through this stuff was that actually people aren't always very clear about the incentives that are being used. Quite a lot of the time, the incentivization being used is something to do with grades. So you get extra points for placing first, second, or third in a competition, or for completing extra credits, or extra exam marks, and so on. I just have to say, from a UK perspective, this is really interesting because this is something I really have never felt able to do in the UK. The sort of institutional rules really restrict us from doing stuff like that. So we were kind of interested in the non-grade incentives as well. And there's relatively few of those mentioned. So we only found 3 examples, which used other things like cash or gift cards. And these are often associated with random draws, quite high numbers, I think. $50 for a random draw, $20 for focus group participation. And then sort of some other interesting things like we're reporting that monetary incentives were used. Not how much, not how, not why, not who that went to. Did it go to everyone, individual? Just monetary incentives were used, which was, kind of interesting. So I'll stop there because I'll leave time for questions. So basically what we're looking at across the set of journals we have here is a strong focus on that sort of US intro micro. And I think probably a lot of opportunities to be much clearer about the ethics and sort of institutional context in which many of these studies are taking place. That's often not very explicit. What we're trying to build on at the moment, I haven't looked at the chat, but I'm going to bet it's in there somewhere, is making sure we've got a complete 5-year set of data that seems to match lots of the other sort of reviews of the stuff you think of but yeah, a lot of the other big reviews that go on in these types of journals. And the other thing we're going back in and adding is not just ethics statements, but also statements about AI, because beyond now, I expect that to change quite a lot. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you, Annika. That was perfect. And we are in the discussion phase of our conversation. I'll try to manage this slightly. Parma's helping me with a little bit of the chat, but I would love to get to the point where you all unmute, turn your cameras on, and ask each other questions without me as the broker or the friction in this conversation. I will get started with the first one. Just Annika, since you just got done, there's a couple of questions for you that people are dying to ask you. The first one that's gotten a lot of traction is, where do you plan on publishing this?
I should check who's asked that before I answer, really, shouldn't I?
That is a great answer, very diplomatic on your behalf.
It was rejected from one place, so
Okay,
there's a couple of others that have been interested. But yeah, publishing it and seeing. I want to finish adding those couple of extra years of data so it's sort of more consistent with what's out there. But
okay.
then it's out there for people to use as they wish.
Perfect. And then Parma had a question about, did you try mapping your findings to the promotion and appraisal framework for teaching track folks to answer the question on the scholarship of teaching and learning, if it matters or what matters?
I haven't done it yet, and I
Mhm.
hadn't, I guess, thought of it in that formula question. At the back of my mind was a really strong thought about how we coach more senior leaders in understanding what's expected of the field. And it's quite hard to do that without data. So I think that was sort of in the back of my mind behind a lot of this, where this work started. But that's a much better way to put it, and we should do that.